The first thing anyone remembered was the heat thick as cloth, pressing against faces and throats as the crowd gathered near the Savannah waterfront. It made tempers short and patience thinner. It turned the iron ring of the auction block hot to the touch and opened the pores on every neck in the square. Up on the platform, a boy stood so lightless in color, he seemed carved from candle wax. Even the flies hesitated before choosing him. The auctioneer, a man whose voice usually rode the humidity like a brass trumpet, faltered. Bids began high for form's sake and tumbled like loose coins down a plank 20, 15, 10, until the square settled into an embarrassed silence that made the gulls' squabbling sound profane. No one wanted bad luck in their fields. Not that season. Not with rumors of storms and rust and God's disfavor muttered in church aisles. Lot 47. The auctioneer tried again, adding a flattering lie about health and work ethic. Eyes slid away. Fingers traced protective signs. A few heads shook in that heavy, sympathetic pity people reserve for things they hope will pass them by. A single fan rose at last, an ivory arc moving with deliberate calm. Everyone recognized the owner before they turned Mrs. Margaret Dunor, the widow at Belmont, an island unto herself 12 miles from the city line. The fan meant money in the same way. A ship's mast means dominion over the water around it. 5. The auctioneer sized, relieved to have any sound to hold. 512, said the widow, not loudly, not kindly, just finally, as if concluding a problem and writing the sum. The assembled company, grateful that the square's uncomfortable spectacle could end in charity, murmured their approval. Someone called, "God bless you, ma'am." Margaret's mouth made the shape of a benevolent smile, the sort she had practiced for a decade, soft at the corners, never reaching the eyes. When the boy was brought down, his pale lashes fluttered against the light. He did not look at her, he looked through her. No, not through. Past toward the line of pines that, from this distance, looked like an answer. In the carriage, she took out a leather book, the color of dried blood, opened to a page whose margin already bore a tidy, subject 0 inches ink, pale enough to disappear unless you were looking for it. She wrote the day's date and the place, and then began to list approximate age, evidence of ocular albinism, hair sparse, white gold, skin translucent in direct sun, ribs visible, hands narrow, feet long, intelligence to be assessed. She did not ask his name in the carriage. Names could wait. Names made claims she did not allow. She glanced up only to fix scale in her mind, measuring him against the window's wood trim, as against the drape tassel, against her own contracted sense of patience. The driver, Augustus, kept his eyes on the rutted road and his tongue in its cage. He had driven this woman across these pines for near 20 years and had learned the art of speech the way a knife learns its sheath only when required. He felt the carriage's weight change, not with the boy's body, it was too slight for that, but with the heaviness people bring when they will live or die somewhere they have never seen. He did not look back. The trees closed in around them, damp undergrowth, breathing resin and rot. Somewhere off the road, a whippoorwill called its name and went unanswered. Belmont did not present its secrets all at once. The main house rose first, white as a tooth in a jaw of green. The front porch, a statement of wealth meant for visitors who counted prestige by columns. But the road did not stop there. It veered like a whispered instruction through thinner paths, into pine whose needles muffled wheel noise, to a cluster of buildings no map maker in the county had ever drawn. They were not large, but they were new and strange, fresh pine boards, lime-washed walls, windows with real glass cut so clean you could find your face in them. They had been built over a decade by hands quickly sold again, their memories scattered like seed across 3 states. Their purpose showed itself only if you watched what entered and what did not leave. Margaret led the boy inside the largest building, the book still open in her hand. The air was cooler in there, not from kindness, from design vents cut for airflow. Windows placed to throw a white spread of light over wooden floors planed until they reflected it back. She opened a door with a key on a chain she wore like a locket. The room beyond contained a bed with a mattress and a chair and a table with a basin. On the wall hung an anatomical chart of the human skeleton. European print, the ink browned around the edges from heat and time. "This will be your room," she said, and the words were organized like shelves orderly, emptied of softness. "You will have food, clothing, and shelter. In return, you will cooperate with examinations, measurements, and instruction. You may ask questions about your lessons. You will ask nothing else." She paused, studied his face, not as a mother studies fear, but as a breeder studies bloodline. "Do you read?" He shook his head. "You will learn." She closed the door, and the key made its clean, bright sound turning in the lock. He did not test the handle. He put the tips of his fingers on the mattress and stepped back as if he'd touched a sleeping thing. The room smelled faintly of lye and new wood, and under it, something metallic. Through the window, he saw a sliver of sky and the black feather of a pine bough and two buildings angled so that anyone moving between them would be visible for exactly 3 steps and invisible thereafter. He sat on the chair because it had a back to hold him upright. He imagined counting to 100 and then to 100 again. He was good at counting. Counting was an animal that would sit in your lap and keep you warm if you never stopped stroking it. Down below, in the building's cool belly, Margaret lit a lamp and set the journal on a table whose scarred surface had been sanded to smooth obedience. She dipped her pen and wrote with a hand that never blotted. August 17. Itembabe Wushawu. Subject 0 delivered to Belmont. Exhibits complete albinism. Begin preliminary measurements at once. Initiate instruction in literacy and natural philosophy tomorrow. Objective, establish baseline health, assess cognitive capacity, prepare for phase 2. She paused to note the exact shade of his irises in daylight pink-gray. Variable, and wrote a line in the margin if theories hold. Subject 0 is the key that eluded us since 42. She underlined key once. She did not underline eluded. She did not permit that verb in her work. People in Chatham County already told stories about Belmont without knowing they were telling them. The tales slid along church pews and behind smokehouses the way fear travels, a quick, unplaceable chill that sometimes deliveries were dropped at the edge of the trees and men ordered to turn around without counting their change. That occasionally someone you knew by face would be sent to Belmont, and later, when you spoke their name, your mouth would feel empty, as if speaking had been the last thing you were supposed to do for them. The official ledgers said nothing. Margaret's private ledgers said everything. She kept them in sequences, measurements in one set, pairings in another, deaths in a third, disguised as weather notes. She catalogued bodies the way other people catalogued seed what, mixed with what, and what it yielded, and which yields were degenerate, and which promised purification. The word meant something different in her mouth. It had nothing to do with God and everything to do with control. Thomas did not sleep that first night. The mattress might as well have been Riverstone. He folded himself into the corner where wall met wall and tried to reduce the surface area of his fear by making his body smaller. The window thinned to a grey square, and he could hear, very far off, the deep, careful tread of someone who had learned to make a large body seem light. In the morning, the key sounded again. She came in with a cloth tape measure, a ledger, and a confidence borrowed from men who thought the world contained no secrets they could not break with patience. She stood him against the doorframe and marked his height with a pencil notch, then noted the number. She measured skull circumference, chest, inseam, shoulder breadth, distance between the inner corners of his eyes, the length of each finger to the nearest 1/8 of an inch. When she was satisfied, she nodded, not to him, to her notes. "Breakfast," she said, and the bowl that followed contained cornmeal, just sweet enough to suggest she understood appetite without honoring it. The tutor came later in the week, a young man whose nervousness arrived in the room 5 minutes before he did. He looked at Thomas the way small animals look at weather. He taught letters with the desperation of someone who believes he is doing something progressive and has told himself this so often he's almost convinced. Robert became Christopher Vance in Margaret's index, his name stitched to 2 pages about lesson plans and the usefulness of reading in cooperative subjects. It did not occur to him that his fear and her calm were part of the same machine. In the yard that afternoon, under tight supervision, Thomas saw the mothers, not many, moving between buildings behind an escort, their faces briefly visible, then lost in the angles. He learned without being told that questions were a form of noise that drew attention you did not survive. So when the driver passed within earshot carrying crates, Thomas did what he had practiced since he was small. He kept his gaze lowered and his ears open. The driver did not look at him, but a muscle jumped in the man's jaw as if his teeth had found something hard. In a few years, that muscle would move again. In a few years, words would find their way from that man's mouth to the right pair of ears. But on this first day, there was only the heat and the chalky taste of lime in the air, and a woman upstairs believing that naming a boy, Subject Zero, made him less than a person and more than a plan. That night, alone again, Thomas discovered the seams of the room by touch. He traced the molding and felt the slight ridge where board met board. He counted the breaths between hallway footsteps and mapped when the lamplight beneath his door thinned and thickened. He followed the moon's movement along the floor and watched it pause briefly on the toe of his shoe, as if choosing him, and then move on. Somewhere beyond the pines, water shifted against a bank, and beyond that the city exhaled the sounds of ships and work and laughter. He could not yet remember how to join. He turned the word's edge in his mouth, Belmont, beautiful mountain, and understood that sometimes people named things for the joke they could not tell aloud. When sleep finally found him, it brought a single, unkind gift, a dream of the auction square. Empty, the platform bare, the crowd gone, the air clear of heat. In the dream he was allowed to step down and walk away, and each step took him closer to the line of pines, and the pines opened, and beyond them was only more road, and at the road's end a door with a keyhole that had never learned the sound of a key. He woke before he could put his hand on it. Morning would begin, and with it, the making of numbers that would fail to measure a human life. The morning sun over Belmont came up hard and white, bleaching color out of everything it touched. By 6, the air already shimmered with heat. Thomas woke to the sound of metal Margaret's key, sliding with the same precision as before. The consistency of that sound would come to rule his days. She entered with her ledger and tape. "Stand," she said. The order was clean, clinical. Measurements came first: height, weight, temperature, pulse. She recorded each figure as if collecting rare specimens. The pencil marks on the doorframe climbed upward in tiny increments like a staircase only she could climb. Thomas noticed that she never asked if he was hungry or tired, only whether he'd memorized yesterday's words. After she left, Augustus arrived with breakfast corn mush, a tin cup of milk. He didn't look at Thomas directly, but his movements had a deliberate gentleness, placing the bowl so it wouldn't spill, sliding a small wooden spoon beside it. Before leaving, he murmured low enough that only the boy could hear. "Eat. Don't speak. She likes quiet." Belmont looked peaceful from the outside, its white columns gleaming against the green, but behind those trees, deeper in the property's hidden section, was the compound, a cluster of strange buildings that didn't belong on any plantation. To the casual visitor, the road beyond the main house led to workshops or stables. In truth, it curved into isolation. Margaret had designed it that way. She'd commissioned each structure in secret between 1843 and 1852, ordering materials from separate suppliers across 3 states, so no one could guess what she was building. When the work was finished, she sold or relocated every laborer involved. No one who'd hammered a nail into those walls remained in Chatham County. The main compound building was square and symmetrical, its walls thick enough to muffle screams. Margaret called it the school. To others it was known quietly, fearfully, as the house behind the pines. Inside, the corridors smelled of pine, pitch, and bleach. Rooms were small, each with a single bed, a wash basin, and a shelf lined with neatly labeled glass jars. No one outside her household had seen these rooms. Not even the overseers were allowed past the main door. Thomas's first week unfolded like a ritual. Each morning brought new rules: what to say, what to touch, how to stand when spoken to. Margaret's handwriting became the shape of his days. She catalogued his reactions to light, his speed at memorizing letters, even the amount of food he consumed before stopping. He didn't yet understand why she studied him this way, only that survival depended on obedience. The tutor, Christopher Vance, arrived twice weekly. He was thin and anxious, a man eager to impress the widow who paid in gold coin. He believed he was part of a noble experiment, testing whether enslaved children could be educated. His letters to friends in Savannah spoke proudly of progress. He never realized that the boy he taught was one of dozens kept under study for a darker purpose. Vance's lessons were formal: reading, writing, arithmetic. But Margaret's personal lessons, the ones she gave herself, were different. She would sit across from Thomas, hands folded neatly on her skirt, and talk about heredity as if discussing divine law. Traits, she explained, determine destiny. Strength begets strength. Weakness repeats itself until bred out. Her voice never rose, but her words struck like the slow tightening of a vice. Thomas listened and nodded. He'd learned that silence earned more safety than questions. Still, he felt something growing beneath her lectures, a faint current of thought that moved without her permission. Margaret's study at the main house was a shrine to her obsession. Books on natural philosophy lined the shelves: Lamarck, Buffon, Cuvier, treatises on animal husbandry, diagrams of selective breeding. Many were banned in polite Southern society for their frankness about human anatomy. But Margaret had long stopped caring about social approval. Her wealth gave her freedom, her intelligence, justification. At night she wrote in her journal, candlelight gilding the ink. Her entries were precise. Subject 0 exhibits rapid intellectual adaptation, response to instruction beyond expectations. Skin translucency confirmed under lamplight. Continue monitoring ocular sensitivity. What she didn't write but always thought was that she had found her beginning. Rumors about Belmont began to spread again that autumn. A trader delivering supplies swore he'd heard crying from the pine woods at dusk. A neighboring planter complained of smoke rising late at night from behind the ridge. No one investigated. Wealth bought privacy, and superstition filled the gaps. People whispered that Mrs. Dunore had special servants who never left her land, that she was experimenting with medicines or witchcraft. Inside the compound, Thomas's world narrowed. He wasn't allowed beyond a fenced yard. Once, he glimpsed another boy through a window, darker-skinned, about his age, but before he could call out, a shadow crossed the glass and the boy vanished. That was the first and last time Thomas saw another child for months. Margaret's control extended to everything: his lessons, his meals, his clothing. She imported linen shirts from Charleston for him. Not out of kindness, but consistency. Uniform subjects produced cleaner data. When she spoke to him, it was never by his name. Subject 0, she would say. Stand still. Subject 0. Read the passage. Only when she was alone, writing in her ledger, did the name Thomas appear written once in a corner, then crossed out. Evenings were the hardest. The compound settled into a silence that seemed deliberate, as if the night itself had been trained. He'd sit by the small window, staring into the blackness between trees, imagining the world beyond it. He didn't remember his mother's face anymore, only her hands the way they'd touched his hair when he was small. That memory became his prayer. One stormy night, he woke to a sound he'd never heard before, a scream that started low and broke off mid-breath. Then nothing. In the morning, Margaret's face was calm, but there were muddy footprints in the corridor leading to the basement. Thomas asked new questions. That afternoon, she arrived with a new notebook labeled Behavioral Variance. Her tone was light, conversational. Do you dream? Subject 0, she asked. He hesitated. Sometimes. What of light? He said, because it seemed harmless. Good, she replied. Writing. Dreams of light suggest optimism, necessary for cooperation. He didn't tell her about the real dream, the one where she stood over him with a measuring tape that stretched forever, winding around his throat until it turned into a noose. By early winter, his lessons expanded. Margaret began teaching him the language of anatomy. He learned words like femur, aorta, mutation. She brought in preserved animal specimens floating in alcohol, pointing out organs as if showing him treasures. When she said, "Soon, we'll study the human form," her eyes shone with something that frightened him more than any punishment. She spoke often of her late husband, a plantation owner who died of fever 13 years earlier. "He left me the land," she said once, "but not the future, that I had to build myself." She never mentioned the child they'd lost before his death, rumored stillborn, though no grave was marked. Neighbors said that was when her obsession began, an idea that life could be corrected, perfected, if one only knew how. Outside, the forest grew thicker, swallowing the compound in shadow. The buildings had no chimneys, so smoke rose only from vents in the ground, thin white threads disappearing into pine. People riding past on the main road could smell burning, but never see it. One evening, as Thomas swept his room under her orders, he found a small mark carved into the floorboard near the bed, a single letter A. He didn't know who had cut it or when, but it reminded him that others had lived here, others who had maybe thought of escape. He pressed his finger into the groove until it hurt, promising himself he'd remember it. Margaret's power over Belmont was absolute. Overseers feared her more than her lawyers or her God. Yet she saw herself as enlightened, a woman of reason among brutes. In her mind, she wasn't cruel, she was curious. When she looked at Thomas, she didn't see a child. She saw a key to questions no man had answered. That winter she wrote in her journal, "Purification requires sacrifice. History rewards those who endure misunderstanding." She sealed the entry with wax, unaware that the foundation of her empire was already cracking, not from rebellion, but from the quiet awareness growing in the mind of the boy she called Subject Zero. As the year ended, the wind shifted through the pines, carrying with it the scent of the river and the faraway sound of church bells from Savannah. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something unfamiliar, something almost like hope. He didn't know yet what shape it would take, only that it existed. And somewhere deep beneath Belmont, in a room lit by oil lamps and the glow of Margaret's ambition, a new page waited blank, patient, hungry for what would come next. By the spring of 1856, Belmont Plantation pulsed like a living organism, each heartbeat dictated by Margaret Dunour's routine. Her compound had grown silent and self-contained, sustained by fear, secrecy, and the precise rhythms of her obsession. Every building breathed in unison with her. Every door creaked, only when she wished it to. For Thomas, the days had begun to blend together until time itself felt circular. Each morning followed the same sequence: the key's turn, the measurements, the silent breakfast, and the arrival of the tutor. At night, Margaret's steps echoed in the hallway like the tick of a clock, marking his captivity. He was 12 now, and the compound had become both his world and his textbook. He read by lamplight, eyes stinging, absorbing words faster than his tutor could test him on them. Vance, the tutor, seemed pleased, mistaking Thomas's quiet intensity for gratitude. In truth, Thomas read because it was the only thing that gave him distance. Words became rooms he could step into when his real one became too small. Margaret observed him constantly. During leçons, she stood at the doorway, pretending to correct posture or pronunciation, but really watching how quickly his mind worked. At night, she wrote observations in her journal with the devotion of a priest recording miracles. Subject Zero demonstrates comprehension of abstract principles at exceptional rate. Reading level advanced. Shows natural aptitude for classification. Logic and retention. Continue academic progression. Begin anatomical instruction. When Margaret began teaching anatomy, the tone of the lessons shifted. Gone were stories of philosophers or poets. In their place came charts of bones and organs, drawings of horses, and the anatomy of the human form stripped of everything that made it human. Nature, Margaret would say, pointing at a sketch of a dissected arm, does not care for sentiment, only function. To understand life, One must dismantle it. Thomas listened, saying little. He realized that for her, science was not about truth, it was about control, and control was something she worshipped. In 1850 seconds, Georgia, the language of heredity was a dangerous new toy among the wealthy. The South's planters had long justified slavery with pseudoscience, but Margaret went further, collecting European texts on racial improvement and breeding theories. She quoted them as scripture, citing phrases about purity, inheritance, and divine hierarchy. To her, humanity was a stable to be organized. Belmont became a laboratory. Within its walls, she categorized people the way others catalogued livestock. Her ledgers grew thicker, pages filled with measurements, sketches, and cryptic notes. Each entry was a person reduced to ratios and observations. For Thomas, the strange thing was how calmly life continued under the weight of horror. The compound had rhythms, footsteps, murmurs, doors closing softly at dusk. There were others, though he rarely saw them. At times he glimpsed movement through cracks in doors, a woman carrying water, a man stacking crates, a figure hunched in a corner of the yard. Faces appeared and vanished like ghosts. Once, while being escorted to a classroom, Thomas saw a girl through a half-open door, young, maybe 16, her eyes hollow and unfocused. She didn't speak, only stared at him with a kind of mute warning. The guard noticed and slammed the door. Later, when he asked Margaret who she was, the woman's face tightened. "You will learn only what I choose to teach you," she said. "Curiosity, in your position, is a defect." From then on, he asked no more questions aloud, but in his mind, he began asking thousands. Augustus, the driver, became the only person who sometimes spoke to him. Short phrases, coded with meaning. "Keep your eyes open," he'd say, or "learn what she knows." It wasn't friendship, it was something heavier. Like a shared sentence neither could escape. Margaret believed her control was absolute, yet even she couldn't silence thought. Her endless lessons had given Thomas something she didn't anticipate: the ability to understand her. He read her books, her notes, her diagrams. He learned not only what she believed, but where she was wrong. At night, while she slept, he recited definitions under his breath: dominant, recessive, mutation. He understood that she saw him as a key to purity, but he began to wonder what would happen if the key refused to turn. He also began to notice inconsistencies in her records. When she spoke of previous subjects, her phrasing sometimes changed. He expired or she proved unsuitable. He saw the same words written in ledgers stacked in her office when she left the door ajar. Unsuitable, degenerator, terminated. Some nights, distant noises reached his window, the low moan of wind, or something that wasn't wind. Once, he thought he heard singing soft, wordless. By morning, that voice was gone. Margaret's isolation deepened as her obsession grew. She rarely visited Savannah anymore. Letters from her peers went unanswered. In her mind, she had crossed a threshold that ordinary people couldn't follow. When she looked at Thomas, she didn't see cruelty. She saw legacy. In April of that year, she introduced him to a new instrument, a microscope. Imported from Philadelphia, polished brass and glass. She taught him how to look through it, how to focus. "This," she said, "is the eye of God. Through it, you will see what others cannot." The first thing Thomas saw beneath the lens was a hair from his own head, pale and luminous. Under magnification, it looked like a strand of glass glowing in the light. "Perfection," Margaret murmured. Watching him, "That is what we must preserve." It was that word preserve that stuck with him. Not protect, not save, but preserve, as if she meant him to be bottled, labeled, and stored. The next months followed a strange calm. Leçons, measurements, silence. He was learning faster than she expected. He could read her books on his own now. And sometimes when she tested him, she smiled a thin, controlled satisfaction that frightened him more than her anger. One afternoon, she brought out an atlas of the human body and asked him to identify each organ. When he named them all correctly, she closed the book and said, "You are beginning to understand why you were chosen." Chosen for what he asked before he could stop himself. For purpose, she said simply, and ended the lesson. By late summer, her writings had taken on a fevered tone. The subject continues to thrive. Intellectual and physical development ideal. Preparations for phase 2 nearing readiness. His condition will reveal whether the purification can be stabilized in a single lineage. What that meant, Thomas didn't know, but the word lineage echoed in his head long after she'd left. Sometimes, while cleaning the small classroom, he found pages torn from books, margins filled with her handwriting, combined pure and mixed bloodlines. Observateur. Select for recurrence. He folded one scrap into his pocket and hid it under the mattress. Not because he planned to use it, but because it was proof that he wasn't imagining her madness. Outside the compound, the world moved on. Steamships docked at Savannah. Newspapers argued about abolition. Whispers of war stirred the air. None of it reached Belmont. The compound existed outside time, a pocket of obsession preserved under George's sun. Then came autumn. The air turned heavy with pine resin. On the evening of September 9th, a thunderstorm rolled over the plantation, splitting trees and flooding fields. Lightning struck close enough to shake Thomas's room. He crouched in the corner, heart pounding, as thunder cracked the sky open. Through the window, he saw Margaret standing in the rain, unmoving, her skirts plastered to her body. She lifted her face to the storm, as if daring God himself to strike her down. When dawn came, she appeared at his door, hair still damp. "Do you believe in divine punishment?" she asked suddenly. He hesitated. "I don't know." "Good," she said. "That means you can still be taught." And with that, she turned and walked away. That night, he wrote the word escape into the dust under his bed. Then he wiped it away before morning. Because at Belmont, even dust could betray you. Winter returned to Belmont like a bruise that refused to fade. The pine needles turned brittle, the air sharp with smoke from fires that burned day and night in the compound's furnaces. Margaret called it the season of clarity. To Thomas, it felt like the world holding its breath before something terrible. He had turned 14. His body was taller now, his voice deeper, though still soft. Margaret seemed pleased with the changes, recording each new measurement with the same clinical detachment as always. But lately, there was something else behind her eyes, an impatience that made the pen tremble slightly in her hand. By then, the routines had become ritual. She measured, observed, questioned, and tested his knowledge as if cataloguing the progress of a specimen rather than a human being. Every word he spoke, every movement he made, became part of her experiment. Then one morning, the lesson changed. Margaret entered his room carrying a thick folder bound with twine. Inside were sketches, detailed anatomical drawings, reproductive diagrams, charts of animal pairings, and handwritten notes. She spread them across his table like cards in a fortune-teller's hand. "You have learned the language of heredity," she said. "Now you will learn its power." Her tone was calm, but her eyes gleamed. She pointed to a chart showing horses and their offspring. "See how certain traits, speed, strength can be refined through selective breeding. By isolating desirable characteristics, imperfections can be erased. The same principle applies to all living things." She turned the page to a human diagram. "Even us." Thomas froze. "Us." She smiled faintly. "Humanity. My dear boy, we are bound by the same natural laws as animals. But unlike them, we can choose improvement." He wanted to ask improvement for whom, but fear held his tongue. Margaret continued, lecturing with the fervor of revelation. She spoke of bloodlines, of eliminating weakness, of creating a purer human strain. Her voice never rose, yet each word pressed harder against his chest. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Subject null shows excellent comprehension. Soon he will understand necessity of participation. He must not only observe but assist. Education ensures compliance. What she didn't know was that her subject had already begun learning something she hadn't intended: how to think beyond her control. During his brief errands inside the compound, Thomas had begun noticing small things, patterns in the schedules. Guards who grew careless after dark. Doors that stayed unlocked for minutes at a time. He stored every detail, never acting, only observing. Margaret had trained him to analyze, and now he was using that gift against her. The only person who spoke to him without cruelty was Augustus. The driver. The old man had grown slower, his hair now streaked with grey, but his eyes still burned with quiet intelligence. Sometimes, while delivering supplies, he lingered near the door to Thomas's room. One afternoon, while Margaret was in town, Augustus whispered, "You keep learning like that. You might find a way out she don't see coming." Thomas stared at him, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "There's no way out." "There's always a way," Augustus said softly, "even if it ain't through the front door." He left before Thomas could reply, but the words stayed. From that day forward, Thomas began reading differently. Not for Margaret, not for survival, but for understanding. He devoured every book she gave him, searching for anything that might reveal weakness about medicine, poison, anatomy, the human mind. In one volume on physiology, he found a line that haunted him: "Even the most perfect organism can fail if deprived of sleep or food." The realization that Margaret was still human, that she could tire, hunger, and air was like oxygen in a sealed room. He began to study her habits, the way she sipped tea at precise intervals, the number of steps she took between her study and the examination room, the times her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it. Observation, he realized, was its own kind of weapon. But Margaret's lessons grew darker. She began teaching him about reproduction not as nature's cycle, but as a system to be controlled. She spoke of breeding pairs, gestation charts, and traits passed down like heirlooms. One day, she said, "You represent what nature tries to hide, a rare configuration of blood and chance. I intend to ensure it never disappears." He didn't understand at first, but later, as she described how certain subjects were paired to produce offspring, he felt the truth settle over him like ice. She meant to use him. That night, he sat awake long after the lamps dimmed. Rain hissed softly outside, tapping against the glass. For the first time, he imagined running through the woods, past the fences, into the dark. But even in his imagination, the dogs always caught him. The next morning, he woke feverish, coughing. Margaret frowned but seemed almost intrigued. "Your constitution must be observed," she said, touching his forehead with the back of her hand. "Even weakness can be instructive." She prescribed rest and broth, confining him to bed for a week. During that time, Augustus brought his meals, sometimes lingering by the door just long enough to whisper a few words. "She watches everything," Augustus said one night, "but she can't see what's in your head. That's yours." Thomas nodded weakly. "Why do you help me?" The driver looked away. "Because I didn't help the others, and I can't carry that again." When Thomas recovered, something inside him had shifted. He no longer looked at Margaret as invincible. She was powerful, yes, but her power depended on obedience, and obedience was a choice, even if the only choice he had left was when to stop giving it. Margaret, oblivious, saw his quiet as submission. She resumed his lessons with renewed vigor, teaching him Latin phrases and the structure of cells. But sometimes, when she lectured about destiny, she caught him watching her not with fear, but calculation. She mistook it for admiration. One afternoon, as he read from an anatomy manual, she asked suddenly, "Do you think knowledge makes one free?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "No," he said. "It just makes the cage easier to see." Her eyes narrowed. For a moment, silence filled the room so completely that even the insects outside seemed to stop. Then she smiled slowly, coldly. "You are clever, Thomas. I value that, but cleverness without obedience is chaos." and chaos must be contained. She left, locking the door behind her. That night, Thomas opened one of her discarded notebooks and stared at the sketches within, half human, half statistical, drawn like blueprints for a future no one should build. At the bottom of one page was a phrase written in Latin: puritas per sacrificium, purity through sacrifice. He tore the page out and hid it under his mattress. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the distant howl of something between a dog and a scream. He didn't know whether it came from the forest or one of the other buildings. He just knew it was human. He whispered to himself, "Remember," because remembering was the only rebellion he had left. And far away, unseen by him, Margaret stood at her window, staring into the dark woods. Her reflection in the glass looked like another woman, a ghostly twin whispering secrets back to her. She whispered one word aloud before turning away. Perfection. But perfection had already learned how to think for itself. October. Itembabe Wushaba. The pines around Belmont dripped with late summer rain, and the earth smelled of decay. For Margaret Dunor, it was a season of promise. For Thomas, it was the season he learned what true fear was. It began with the arrival of the stranger. Dr. Harrison Pembroke came unannounced, stepping down from his carriage in a grey travelling coat, the kind of coat men wore to imply intelligence. He carried a valise and the restless confidence of a man used to being heard. The letter of introduction he offered to Margaret bore the seal of the Medical Society of Charleston, and a few lines written in the polished, self-important hand of a Southern scholar. Dr. Pembroke pursues the study of hereditary disease and its elimination by scientific means. A gentleman of sound reputation. Margaret read the letter twice, weighing risk against opportunity. A physician from Charleston meant knowledge, perhaps validation, and yet validation was also exposure. She smiled anyway. Welcome to Belmont. Doctor, you will find much here to interest you. When Thomas first saw him, the doctor looked like every other white man who'd come to the compound, too clean, too sure, but his eyes were different. They were bright, searching, curious men. Thomas had learned were the most dangerous kind. That evening, Margaret hosted him in the main house. She poured tea, her movements graceful, rehearsed. They spoke in the polite tones of scholars discussing weather, while beneath the surface, something older and darker moved ambition, recognizing itself in another. Pembroke talked of selective medicine and of improving humanity through breeding out weakness. Imagine, he said, a world where disease is extinct, where inferior stock is prevented from reproducing. He spoke with passion, not cruelty, as if preaching a gospel of progress. Margaret listened, her pulse quickening. Your ideas, she said, echo thoughts I have long pursued in private. When he looked intrigued, she added, perhaps you would care to see my work. The next morning, she led him through the forest path toward the compound, the path even overseers avoided. The ground was slick from last night's rain, the air heavy with pine sap. She spoke as they walked, describing her studies with an almost maternal pride. Pembroke's question came rapid, technical, hungry. By the time they reached the first building, his excitement was barely disguised. Inside, she showed him the journals, row upon row of ledgers filled with measurements, family charts, and coded observations. Pembroke ran his fingers along the spines like a man in a library of forbidden scripture. Extraordinary, he murmured. Such consistency of record. You have maintained this for over a decade. 13 years. Margaret replied. Every birth, every pairing, every deviation. I have sought to trace the hereditary patterns of what I called purity of form. Pembroke's gaze sharpened. And your subjects? Enslaved, she said simply, selected for particular characteristics. Their owner's permission is unnecessary. I am their owner. If he felt discomfort, he hid it well. You have achieved what most theorists only dream of: controlled variables, generations of data in isolation. This could change the science of inheritance. Margaret smiled, hearing in his words not horror, but admiration. Then you will appreciate the culmination of my efforts. She gestured toward a heavy oak door. Come. There is one subject whose development surpasses all others. When Thomas heard the approaching footsteps, he knew something was different. Margaret never brought visitors to his room. He stood from his table as the door opened. She entered first, composed as always. Behind her, the tall, angular figure of the stranger. This is Subject Zero, Margaret announced. Pembroke stared openly, fascination etched across his face. An albino, he whispered, stepping closer. Remarkable. Skin almost translucent. Iris pink-gray. Healthy musculature despite pigmentation deficiency. You've kept him well. Margaret nodded. I have ensured optimal health and education. He reads, writes, and understands the principles of anatomy and heredity. He will soon assist in practical studies. Pembroke crouched, examining Thomas like one might inspect a rare animal. You can speak. Boy. Yes. Sire. Thomas said quietly, his voice measured. Practiced. Good. Read this. Pembroke handed him a page torn from one of Margaret's journals. Thomas read each line aloud with precision. The doctor chuckled. Impressed. Exceptional. You've taught him proper diction. Margaret's tone was cool. Intelligence must be cultivated for cooperation. He must understand his role. Pembroke straightened, clasping his hands behind his back. And what role is that? Precisely. The propagation of purity, she said. He will be paired with selected females to observe hereditary transmission of his condition. Thomas stood motionless, the words sinking like stones into water. Pembroke blinked. Processing. You mean you intend to breed him? Of course, Margaret replied, unflinching. Enslaved boys of his age father children daily. The difference here is method, observation, control. This is science, not impulse. For a long moment, the doctor said nothing. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. Curiosity won. If the records are thorough, he said finally, the results could be invaluable. A small smile touched Margaret's lips. Then we understand each other. That afternoon, Pembroke toured the rest of the compound, inspecting the specimens preserved in jars in the copper-lined basement fetuses, organs, malformed limbs. His face showed brief discomfort, but also wonder, like a man peering over the edge of a forbidden cliff. You conducted these dissections yourself. I did, Margaret answered. My anatomical instruction was limited, but precision improves with practice. He shuddered, but his voice was reverent. You have achieved more here than any university laboratory in the South. You must allow me to collaborate. Margaret's eyes gleamed. Perhaps, she said, if you can be trusted with discretion. By evening, their alliance was sealed over a glass of port and a mutual delusion that they were pioneers misunderstood by a lesser world. From his room, Thomas heard their laughter drifting down the corridor, muffled but distinct. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it seeped through the cracks anyway, the sound of monsters congratulating themselves for being enlightened. When night fell, Margaret came to his door. Doctor, Pembroke is impressed, she said, her tone almost warm. He believes, as I do, that you will advance the boundaries of knowledge. Thomas said nothing. You should be proud, she continued. Few in your condition will ever serve a greater purpose. Still, he said nothing. His silence was the only freedom left. After she left, locking the door, he stared at the wall until his vision blurred. He wasn't thinking of escape anymore. He was thinking of survival. And survival meant waiting for weakness, for an opening, for anything that might crack the walls of her perfect world. In the weeks that followed, Pembroke's visits became frequent. He brought instruments, notebooks, and new ideas. Margaret's excitement grew feverish. She spoke of Phase 2, of controlled pairings. Thomas pretended ignorance, but every word was recorded in his memory. One evening, while delivering supplies, Augustus leaned close to Thomas's door and whispered, "She's building something worse than hell." "Boy, but even hell burns down if you light it from inside." Then he walked away before Thomas could ask what he meant. That night, as thunder rolled over the forest, Thomas made a promise to himself, a vow he would repeat silently every night that followed. "If I cannot stop her, I will remember," because memory, he realized, was stronger than any wall. And somewhere above him, in the lamplight of her study, Margaret wrote a single line in her ledger, underlined twice. "Commence the breeding phase within 6 months. Subject 0 fully compliant. Results will secure immortality." But she was wrong about one thing. Thomas was no longer compliant, only quiet. And quiet, as history would one day learn, is the most dangerous sound of all. The first frost of November 1858 came earlier than anyone in Chatham County could remember. It settled over the pines like a veil of glass, silent and sharp, muting the forest's usual murmur. The air smelled of wood smoke and iron. At Belmont, that silence carried through the halls, broken only by the soft scrape of paper and the faint click of Margaret Dunour's pen. She was preparing for what she called the breeding phase. The compound had changed. Margaret ordered new instruments shipped from Charleston, sterilized clamps, copper basins, medical journals, and fabric imported from England for swaddling infants of scientific importance. Pembroke supervised deliveries personally, overseeing every crate with the enthusiasm of a man standing at the threshold of discovery. To them, it was progress. To everyone else trapped in that place, it was prophecy. Thomas had grown leaner. His skin, still ghostly pale, seemed to catch and reflect every flicker of lamplight. Margaret watched him constantly, noting every sign of maturity with satisfaction. "You are nearly ready," she told him one evening, her tone almost affectionate. "Nature has chosen you for something extraordinary." He no longer responded. By mid-November, 3 young women were transferred to the compound from the main plantation. Each arrived under guard and was taken directly to a separate dormitory. Their names were written into Margaret's record book: Eliza, Sarah, and Hannah. She chose them carefully. Each possessed what she described as favorable phenotypes: symmetrical faces, strong bone structure, clear health records. None of them understood why they had been chosen. Margaret explained it only once, in that clipped, sermon-like voice that reduced horror to procedure. "You have been selected for a purpose. Your cooperation will advance human knowledge. You will be cared for, fed, and clothed. Resistance will only bring hardship." Her words hung in the air like frost. When Thomas first saw Eliza, she was standing in the hallway outside his room, her wrists bound loosely in front of her. She had the delicate features of mixed ancestry skin, the color of warm clay, eyes that still held traces of fight. Their gazes met only for a moment before Margaret's voice cut the air. Inside, the door closed. The lock turned. It was the beginning. That afternoon, Pembroke arrived carrying his medical bag and notebooks. He spoke in low tones with Margaret near the door, using words that turned human bodies into equations, pairings, gestation, phenotype variants. Then Margaret gave the command. The women were brought in one by one, and Thomas understood. He understood too late. The hours that followed were something that language can never truly contain. Margaret recorded times, durations, and physiological notes. Pembroke documented every detail in the calm voice of a clinician. For them, it was data collection. For Thomas and the women, it was violation sanctified by science. Elisa did not cry. She endured with eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, her silence an act of defiance. Sarah screamed until her voice broke. Hannah stared at nothing at all. When it was over, Margaret dismissed them like tools returned to a shelf. That night, Pembroke and Margaret toasted brandy in the study, a historic beginning. She said, "Within months, we will see the first results." Pembroke nodded, already writing in his ledger, subject 0. First reproductive trials successful. Controlled conditions optimal. But not everything was under control. Days passed. Eliza refused to eat. Sarah attempted to harm herself using a broken shard of glass from the wash basin. Margaret punished both with isolation dark rooms, water rations, silence. Hannah obeyed every order, but moved through the halls like a ghost. Her face hollowed of expression. Thomas barely spoke. He worked, studied, and endured. But each night, when he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza's face. He remembered the tremor in her hands, the way she whispered to herself afterward, "My baby's gone." She took her. That phrase became a key. It opened something inside him that could never close again. Winter deepened. Weeks turned into months. Margaret monitored every cycle, every symptom. Pembroke returned frequently, his fascination growing as his conscience eroded. "We may be witnessing the dawn of a new biological order," he said once. "Imagine controlled heredity, perfected humanity." Margaret's reply was simple: immortality. "Doctor, through design." But design had its limits. By February, only Eliza showed signs of pregnancy. Margaret treated her like a vessel, not a person. Daily measurements, restricted diet, constant supervision. Eliza's stomach swelled as the others faded. Sarah grew frail. Hannah spoke less and less. The compound became a tomb of whispers. Thomas observed it all in silence. He was obedient, measured, compliant, but inside, he was watching everything. When he was permitted in the yard for exercise, Augustus sometimes passed near enough to speak without looking at him. "I seen her," the driver murmured once, meaning Eliza. "She don't last long if they don't stop this." "They won't stop," Thomas whispered back. "Then you got to find a way." "How?" Augustus's voice was low, barely audible. "She taught you words. Use them. She taught you numbers. Count how long before she sleep, how long before she eat, how long before she open that door. You got to think like she do, only backwards." Then he walked away, leaving Thomas with a truth so sharp it almost felt like hope. He began keeping a secret ledger of his own, scraps of paper hidden under floorboards, marked with crude symbols that only he understood. He recorded times, movements, patterns. It was not escape he planned yet, it was knowledge. A record, something to survive when he might not. In early May, Eliza went into labor. Margaret and Pembroke attended the birth personally. They treated her agony as background noise. Thomas was locked in his room, but he could hear the cries roar, echoing through the walls, followed by the thin, piercing wail of a newborner. Then silence. Hours later, Margaret entered his room, her face composed, her gloves stained. "The child has been born," she said calmly. "A female, healthy, normal pigmentation. We will continue the line." Her words blurred together in his mind. "We will continue the line." That night, he heard Eliza's voice through the walls, soft, broken, singing to something that no longer answered. The song ended with a sob that turned into silence. The next morning, the compound was quieter than ever. Margaret recorded one more line in her journal before breakfast. Generation 1, female 1, designated for back-crossing to subject 0 at maturity, Eliza proving unstable, intervention required. Thomas never saw Eliza again, but he never forgot her final act, the one the records would later call a tragedy of maternal weakness. What Eliza did that night, she did out of love so fierce it defied reason. She ensured that her child would never grow old enough to be used. When Margaret found them the next morning, her fury shook the compound. Her note simply read, "Both subjects terminated. Cause undetermined. Disposal completed." But in the forest beyond Belmont, 2 small graves appeared that week, marked only by wooden stakes, and from that day on, the pines around the compound grew thicker, as if nature itself was trying to hide what had happened. Margaret's work continued. Of course, her ambition was too vast to stop for grief. She replaced Eliza's name in her journal with a new column labeled Future Subjects. She never wrote failure. She wrote lesson. For Thomas, it was both a lesson and a vow. He would endure, as Elisa had, but he would remember everything, every sound, every face, every name that Margaret tried to erase, because if survival meant submission, then memory would have to serve as rebellion. And somewhere outside, beyond the trees, the first whispers of war had begun. May 17th, 1859, the birth of Eliza's child was supposed to mark the triumph of Margaret Dunour's grand experiment. Instead, it became the moment the entire illusion began to rot from within. The day was humid, thick with storm clouds pressing low over the pine canopy. Inside the main building, Margaret and Dr. Pembroke worked under lamplight, their hands moving with the precision of men and women who believed themselves above consequence. Eliza's screams echoed off the walls, rising and falling like waves. When, at last, the infant emerged small, slick, crying, Margaret's first act was not comfort but inspection. She held the newborn beneath the light, turning the tiny body this way and that, studying skin and eyes. Brown, she murmured, hair black, eyes dark. Pembroke nodded, jotting notes, normal pigmentation. Recessive expression confirmed absent. It was the verdict of disappointment. To Margaret, the baby was not a child. It was data that failed to support her theory. Recessive, she repeated, already calculating. Then the solution is simple. Controlled backcrossing. Subject 0 must be bred to his own offspring when she reaches maturity. That will increase the probability of albinism in the second generation. Elisa, barely conscious, understood enough to choke out a whisper. No. Her voice cracked the air like a prayer that had lost its god. Margaret ignored her. Feed the child for 1 week. Then remove her. The wet nurse will continue care. When Thomas heard the infant's cries that night, through the thin walls, he sat motionless on his bed, hands pressed to his ears. The sound was soft at first, then fading, until silence fell heavy and final. He did not yet know what Eliza had done, but deep down he understood there are some forms of mercy that only the desperate can perform. 3 days later, the screams stopped entirely. In her journal, Margaret wrote with a surgeon's detachment, Generation 1. Female 1 expired due to natural weakness. Subject Eliza deemed unfit for further breeding protocols. Removed from records. But among the workers, whispers spread. Augustus had seen 2 small bodies wrapped in linen carried into the forest before dawn. He knew the path well, the hidden cemetery Margaret used for disposals. That morning, he dug 2 graves side by side, one larger, one small. He said nothing. The forest said nothing, but the pines began to hum in the wind like voices trying to speak. After that week, the compound fell eerily quiet. Sarah and Hannah no longer looked at Thomas. Even the guards spoke less. The air hung thick with a grief that dared not show its face. Thomas tried to write what had happened in the scraps of paper he hid beneath his floorboard, but when he wrote Eliza's name, his hand shook. He tore the page in half. Margaret continued her work as if nothing had happened. Every morning, she reviewed her ledgers, recalculating her formulas, never once acknowledging the silence left in Eliza's absence. She told Pembroke, "Failure is the seed of refinement." He agreed, though the tone of his voice had begun to change. By summer, Margaret sensed his hesitation. "You have grown quiet, Doctor," she said one evening as they catalogued specimens in the basement. "De conscience trouble you." Pembroke didn't meet her eyes. "I am a man of science." "Mrs. Dunour. Not sentiment. But what happened to that woman? Subject Eliza." She corrected. He swallowed. "Yes. Subject Eliza. It was regrettable." Margaret smiled faintly. Regrettable is the word weak men use when describing progress. Pembroke said nothing more. But that night, after she retired, he sat in his quarters and drank until dawn. In July, a new visitor arrived, a man whose presence would set events in motion that neither Margaret nor Pembroke could control. Dr. Samuel Hargrave of Atlanta came accompanied by a young assistant named Robert Chen, a Chinese-born medical scholar trained in Philadelphia. They had read one of Pembroke's papers in a Charleston journal hinting at hereditary experiments conducted under controlled plantation conditions. Hargrave had come seeking collaboration. Margaret welcomed them, flattered by the attention. "Science is always starved of brave minds," she said. From the moment he arrived, Robert Chen observed everything with quiet intensity. He noted the unnatural silence of the compound, the hollow faces of the people who moved through it, the sterile smell of lye and alcohol that clung to the walls. When Margaret began to describe her purification project, his face paled. "You speak of breeding human beings," he said carefully, as if they were livestock. Margaret's eyes glinted. "All life obeys the same laws." "Mr. Chen, I merely observe them more clearly than most." Hargrave tried to diffuse the tension. "Mrs. Dunore's work is controversial." "Yes, but extraordinary in its scope." "Extraordinary," Chen repeated, his voice tight, "is not the word I would use." Margaret ignored him. She led them through her archive room, past rows of journals and jars, the preserved remains of infants floating like ghosts in amber fluid. Chen stopped in front of one, the body of a baby whose tiny hand was pressed against the glass as though reaching for light. His stomach turned. "What you are doing here," he said quietly, "is not science. It's desecration." Margaret's voice was smooth. "Young men often mistake emotion for morality. You will learn the difference." But Chen had already made up his mind. That evening, he spoke privately with Hargrave. "We must report this. To the medical society. To the courts, anyone." Hargrave hesitated. "Do you have any idea what that would mean, accusing a woman of her standing in Georgia?" "I don't care about her standing," Chen said. "I care about the lives she's destroying." Margaret sensed their discord. Her instincts, honed by years of manipulation, warned her that Chen was dangerous not for what he could do, but for what he could say. The next morning, she confronted him. "You disapprove," she said simply. "I do. And yet you came. Curiosity brought you here. Did it not?" "I came seeking knowledge," Chen replied. "I found horror." Their eyes met hers cold, his burning with restrained fury. "You will leave my property by noon," she said. "Take your sanctimony with you." Before departing, Chen passed down the corridor where Thomas's room stood. Through the small window, he saw the pale boy sitting at his desk, head bent over a page. Their eyes met. "What is your name?" Chen asked softly. "Thomas," he said. "How long have you been here?" "5 years." "Sire, do you want to leave?" The question was so foreign, it took Thomas several seconds to understand it. "Yes," he whispered. Chen nodded slowly. "Then remember this moment. Someone knows you exist." He left before Margaret could catch him speaking. That night, the compound was restless. Thomas sat awake until dawn, replaying those words. "Someone knows you exist." It was the first time in 5 years that he allowed himself to believe he might not die in Belmont. Robert Chen returned to Atlanta and began writing letters to medical boards, newspapers, abolitionist groups. He described Belmont in precise, restrained language that somehow made it even more horrific. A plantation in Chatham County, he wrote, where a woman of means conducts human breeding experiments under the guise of science. A boy of pale complexion known as Subject Zero is her centerpiece. Most ignored him. Some doubted him. But one man read those words and listened. Augustus. Through the whisper network of free laborers and black sailors in Savannah, the letter reached him. He sought out Chen in secret, traveling at night, slipping past patrols. When they met in a warehouse near the docks, Augustus told everything he knew: the names, the graves, the screams that haunted the forest. "Then help me," Chen said. "Help me end it." 2 weeks later, armed with Augustus's map and sworn testimony, Chen convinced Sheriff William Pritchard to act. On January 23rd, they rode to Belmont with 2 deputies and a court order. Margaret met them at the door. her calm mask unbroken. "Gentlemen," she said, "you are trespassing." But when they forced open the doors to the compound, even the seasoned sheriff staggered back. The air reeked of alcohol and decay. The basement walls were lined with glass jars, dozens of them. And in the farthest room, locked behind an iron bolt, they found Thomas, thin, silent, alive. When the light touched his face, he blinked, as though sunlight was something he had dreamed of but never truly believed existed. Margaret's voice, trembling for the first time in her life, broke the silence. "He's mine." Sheriff Pritchard turned to her. "Not anymore." Outside, the frost was melting. The ground began to soften, revealing what the earth had tried for years to keep hidden. The truth of Belmont Plantation was about to be exhumed. The January wind cut through the pines like a blade as Sheriff Pritchard and his men began their inspection of the compound. Frost crunched beneath their boots. Each door they opened revealed another layer of horror cells turned classrooms. Examination rooms reeking of alcohol and blood. Walls lined with anatomical drawings scrawled in Margaret's delicate, precise handwriting. Thomas sat wrapped in a rough wool blanket near the fire in the sheriff's wagon, his skin too pale for the winter light, his hands trembling from shock. He said little at first, answering Pritchard's questions with the quiet obedience beaten into him by years of captivity. But when Robert Chen knelt beside him and spoke softly, "You are safe now, Thomas. No one here will harm you." Something inside the boy seemed to unlock. He began to speak, not in bursts, not in confusion, but in calm, deliberate detail, the only way he knew how. After years of clinical observation, he told them about the measurements, the breeding charts, the examinations. He told them about the women Eliza, Sarah, Hannah, and the small graves hidden in the woods. Chen wrote everything down, every word. By nightfall, Pritchard understood that what he'd uncovered wasn't just cruelty, it was a system, a machine built for suffering under the guise of science. He placed Margaret Dunore under house arrest that evening, confining her to her main residence until formal charges could be filed. She did not resist. She only asked for her journals. "Those are evidence," Pritchard said. "They are history." She replied coldly, "You'll understand one day." But Pritchard had no intention of understanding. Within days, the story spread quietly through Savannah's legal and medical circles. Whispers about the widow's compound circulated behind closed doors. Publicly, officials remained silent, too aware of Margaret's influence and her family's wealth. Privately, they were horrified. Chen gathered every scrap of corroboration he could: Augustus's testimony, Margaret's surviving records, Pembroke's notes, and Thomas's first-hand account. He believed it would be enough, but Margaret's lawyers believed otherwise. When her defense team arrived from Charleston, they came armed, not with evidence but with law. In Georgia, Etienne Barbe Luche, the law was on Margaret's side. Enslaved people were property. Their reproduction was the owner's right to manage. There was no legal precedent for crimes against them, no statute to define consent, no crime of forced breeding, no recognition of murder when the victim was considered a possession. Margaret's lead attorney, a man named Francis Wycliffe, summarized the defense in one chilling sentence: Mrs. Dunore did nothing unlawful. She simply used her property in a manner befitting her scientific interest. Chen's moral conviction meant nothing in the courtroom. The testimonies of Augustus and the other enslaved witnesses were ruled inadmissible. Thomas could speak barely, but his status as formerly enslaved rendered his words unreliable. For a time, it seemed Margaret would walk free. Then, an unexpected figure appeared at the courthouse: Dr. Harrison Pembroke. He had been living in Charleston, drinking himself into ruin since leaving Belmont. When he read the reports of the investigation, something inside him broke. The weight of what he had done, what he had helped, finally became unbearable. He arrived in Savannah, unshaven and trembling, clutching a leather case filled with his own notes. "I participated," he told the court. "Everything the boy said is true." His testimony changed everything. Pembroke described Margaret's compound in excruciating detail: the forced pairings, the dissections, the preservation of infant remains. He admitted to performing examinations, recording data, and publishing preliminary findings that disguised atrocities as research. His words, unlike Chen's, could not be dismissed. He was white, southern, and respected. When asked why he had come forward, Pembroke's answer silenced the room. Because science without mercy is hell, he said, and I helped build it. The courtroom fell quiet. For the first time, Margaret's mask cracked. She stared at Pembroke, eyes wide with fury and disbelief, not because he betrayed her, but because he dared to repent. Still, Wycliffe fought back. Moral sentiment is not a legal argument. He told the judge, even if every word is true, no law has been broken. He was right technically, and for months, the case dragged on without resolution. Then, on March 14th, the turning point came, following a lead from Augustus. Chen and Sheriff Pritchard led a search into the pine forest behind the compound. Beneath the twisted roots of old trees, they found disturbed soil. The ground was uneven, pocked with depressions where the earth had settled over time. When the men began to dig, the first spade hit wood, then bone, one grave, then another, and another. By sunset, they had uncovered fragments from more than 40 distinct graves. Infants, women, men, none recorded in any ledger, none marked by name. Pritchard stood over the open pits, pale as death. She didn't just experiment, he said quietly. She murdered them. That night, Chen wrote in his journal, the forest gave them back. The dead will speak for themselves. Margaret was confronted with the discovery the next morning. Her expression never changed. The deaths were unfortunate, she said, but necessary. When pressed further, she added only, if you wish to understand creation, you must first learn to destroy. Even her own lawyers looked away. Formal murder charges were filed the following week, but fate had other plans. In April 1861, as the first cannon fire thundered over Fort Sumter, the Civil War began. Georgia descended into chaos. The courts emptied, records burned. The Belmont case vanished beneath the roar of war. Margaret Dunor was never tried. In June 1861, under the cover of wartime confusion, she sold the plantation and disappeared west into Alabama. Some said she died of fever. Others whispered she continued her work in secret. No grave was ever found. But Belmont did not die with her. In 1959, when highway crews unearthed a buried ledger sealed inside a foundation wall, the truth resurfaced like a body the earth could no longer hold. The journal's ink was faded, but legible page after page of measurements, sketches, and that haunting phrase written in Margaret's hand, Subject Zero, the foundation of purity. That discovery sparked outrage, disbelief, and ultimately silence. The state archived the ledger. Historians wrote a few papers. Then, as always, the world moved on. Only one family did not. Thomas's descendants, living quietly in Savannah, read the reports when they surfaced in 1969. They saw their grandfather's name printed beside words like experiment and subject, and for the first time, they understood the truth he had carried all his life. He had survived, not by escaping Belmont, but by remembering it. Thomas never spoke publicly. He lived, worked as a carpenter, raised his children, and died in 1902 at the age of 56. But his silence was not cowardice. It was endurance, the kind that transforms trauma into warning. Because Margaret's story, grotesque as it was not unique. Across the 19th century, the language of science became a veil for unspeakable acts in America. In Europe, everywhere human curiosity outran compassion. Belmont was simply one plantation that wrote its cruelty down. And that ledger, the one sealed behind the wall, was not a confession. It was pride. Margaret Dunor had hidden her journal because she believed history would one day vindicate her. It did not. Today, The land where Belmont once stood lies beneath a stretch of asphalt Highway 204, just west of Savannah. Cars speed across it every day, their tires whispering over the buried graves of those who never had names. No sign marks the site. Only a faint rise in the pine forest remains, and in the county cemetery is a single stone inscribed in 1960 in memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation. 1,842, 1,860. May they rest in peace. May we never forget. But history does forget. It always tries to. That is why stories like this must be told, because the most terrifying horrors are not those born of myth, they are those written in perfect handwriting, bound in leather, and labeled progress. So ask yourself, when does knowledge become cruelty? When does curiosity become God? And if Margaret Dunor truly vanished into the fog of war, what other experiments, hidden behind respectability, have yet to be unearthed? Because sometimes the graves are deeper than we think.